Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unlikely places. In the blistering summer of 1887, a mountain of a man named Barrett Callahan made a choice. A choice that would drag his quiet life into a storm of bullets, conspiracy, and secrets that could topple empires. It all started in a dusty saloon in Dry Hollow, Arizona, over a poker game that had gone on way too long. The heat in the town was a physical thing, trapped by the red rock formations like a kiln. Dust devils spun down the main street like angry ghosts. Inside Murphy's saloon, the air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale tobacco, and desperation. And no one was more desperate than Silas Morton. Barrett Callahan, standing 6'6" in his worn boots, rolled a lucky poker chip between his scarred fingers. A habit from his old life. A life he'd tried to bury under 15 miles of ranch land and 3 years of raising cattle. But a man's shadow always follows him, and Barrett's was long and dark. He'd been a feared outlaw. Now, he was just a rancher. Or so he told himself. "Your move, Callahan," growled Morton. The traveling gambler was a twitchy, thin man, sweating through his shirt. His eyes darted from his cards to the pile of money in the center of the table, a pile that was mostly Barrett's. Barrett glanced at his hand. It was good enough. But more importantly, he could read the terror in Morton's eyes. The man was bluffing on an empty pocket and a prayer, and Barrett was fresh out of mercy. "I'll see that bet." Barrett's voice was a low rumble. "And I'll raise you 50. He pushed the coins forward. They clinked together with the finality of a cell door slamming shut. Morton's face went white. His hands shook. The other men at the table, Doc Harrison, Jake Miller the storekeeper, a young ranch hand, had all folded long ago. They were just watching the show. I don't have it," Morton whispered. The words died in the stale air. "Then you fold," Doc Harrison said, already grabbing his hat. "Wait!" Morton's voice cracked. "I've got something else. Something valuable." Barrett raised a single eyebrow. He'd heard this line before. It never ended well. "I'm listening." Morton licked his dry lips, his gaze flicking toward the saloon doors. "She's outside, in my wagon, a young woman, clean, well-behaved. She's worth more than $50, I can promise you that." The table went silent. Even in the rough and tumble Arizona territory, there were lines you didn't cross. Trading a human being for a poker debt was spitting right on that line. Barrett's hand stopped moving. The poker chip grew still between his fingers. His jaw tightened. "You're talking about a person," he said, and the words were laced with a cold danger that made Morton physically shrink in his chair. "It's all legal," Morton said, too quickly. "Indentured servant. I have the papers. She owes a debt, and I hold the marker. Nothing improper." Barrett stared at the man, seeing the lies tangled with the truth. The papers were probably worthless. But the woman was real, and leaving her with a snake like Morton was a death sentence of a different kind. A slow, ugly death, town by town. "Bring her in," Barrett said, his voice flat. Morton scrambled from his chair and rushed out the door like a man escaping the gallows. The other players looked at each other, but nobody spoke. They knew Barrett's reputation. They knew this was about to get complicated. A few minutes later, Morton returned, and behind him walked the woman who would change everything. She moved with a quiet grace that was completely out of place in the grimy saloon. Her dress was plain brown, her boots were worn, but she held her head high, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Dark hair was pulled back, but a few strands framed a face that held a surprising strength. But it was her eyes that caught him. Deep brown, calm, and intelligent. They were like still water, and Barrett knew still water ran the deepest. She wasn't just there. She was observing, calculating, judging every man in that room. "This is her," Morton said, like he was selling a prize mare. "Elena, she's a hard worker, good cook, be worth her keep on any ranch." Elena said nothing, But Barrett saw her jaw clench almost imperceptibly. She heard every word, and she despised the man who spoke them. Barrett stood to his full, towering height. Morton flinched back. Elena, who barely came up to Barrett's shoulder, didn't flinch at all. She met his gaze directly, and in that moment, Barrett saw it. Hidden deep behind that mask of dignity was fear. Not fear of him, but fear of being left behind with Morton. It was the same fear Barrett had seen in his own reflection years ago when he was the one running. That one look sealed Morton's fate. "The bet stands," Barrett said, sitting back down. He laid his cards on the table. Full house, queens over tens. Morton's face fell as he showed his worthless hand. A pair of eights. He'd bet his soul on a bluff and lost. "She's yours, then," Morton spat, shoving the flimsy papers across the table. He grabbed his hat and practically ran for the door. "And good riddance." Barrett watched him go, then glanced at the papers. Just as he'd suspected. Worthless. But they were enough. For now. The woman, Elena, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, with a slight, unplaceable accent. "Mr. Callahan, I assume? I understand I am now in your debt." Her tone was respectful, but not subservient. It was the voice of someone educated, someone who didn't belong here. "You're not in my debt," Barrett said, standing and tucking the papers into his vest. "But you are my responsibility." He gestured to the door. "I have a ranch outside town. You can stay there until we figure this out." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Then, relief. She gave a single graceful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I am grateful for your kindness." As they walked out into the cooling evening air, Barrett found himself wondering just what kind of storm had brought this woman to his doorstep. Whatever it was far from over. He helped her onto his horse, Charlie, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of Dry Hollow, he was acutely aware of her presence. The way she held herself, the faint scent of lavender, the careful way she watched the landscape as if committing it to memory. The rocking sea ranch was his sanctuary, a valley sheltered by red rocks, fed by a spring. A place he'd bought with money he never talked about. A place he'd built to escape his past. As they approached the simple, well-built stone house, Elena spoke. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's home," Barrett replied, the word feeling truer than it ever had before. He showed her to the spare bedroom. "We can talk tomorrow," he said, lighting an oil lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. She paused in the doorway and turned to face him. In the warm lamplight, her inner strength seemed to glow. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "whatever Morton told you, the truth is likely more complicated." Barrett met her gaze, seeing the honesty and the carefully guarded secrets. "Most truths are," he said, and then she smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the woman she was beneath the weight she carried. "Good night, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Good night, Elena." As she closed the door, Barrett stood alone in his house, rolling the old poker chip between his fingers. He had a feeling his quiet life had just ended. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly song. He looked out at the land he'd tamed, now with a complete stranger under his roof. A stranger who was hiding something. And he had a gut feeling that whatever it was dangerous. But he also knew she didn't deserve the fate Morton had in store for her. For the first time in a long time, Barrett Callahan didn't feel quite so alone. And he had no idea how much trouble was riding their way. 3 days passed. A strange peace settled over the rocking sea. Elena moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that made it feel more like a home than it ever had. She cooked, she mended, she worked without complaint. But Barrett was a man who noticed things. He noticed the way she held herself when she thought he wasn't looking. Regal, like a queen. not a servant. He noticed her accent, which became more pronounced when she was tired, hinting at a European education. And he noticed the pale, faint line on her ring finger. A mark left by a ring that had been there for a very long time. Something valuable had recently been removed. On the morning of the fourth day, Barrett was out mending a fence when he saw it. A dust cloud on the horizon. Moving too fast to be cattle. Moving too straight to be weather. That only left one thing. Trouble. He whistled for Charlie and swung into the saddle, his hand instinctively resting on the colt, 45 at his hip. The old habits died hard. As he galloped toward the house, the dust cloud resolved into 3 riders. They were already dismounting near his front porch. Through the window, he saw Elena, and he was relieved she had the good sense to stay inside. These men weren't here for a friendly chat. The way they wore their guns, low and tied down, screamed professional. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Barrett called out, his voice deceptively calm. It was a tone that had been the last thing many men had heard. The leader was a tall man with cold, ice-like eyes and prematurely gray hair. He looked out of place in the desert, his clothes too clean. The other 2 were pure muscle, with scarred faces and the dead-eyed stare of men who did ugly work for a living. "Name's Garrett," the leader said, tipping his hat in a gesture that was anything but polite. "We're looking for someone. A young woman, dark hair, goes by the name of Elena." Barrett kept his face a neutral mask. "That's a popular name in a big territory. What's your business with her?" Garrett's smile was as thin as a razor. "Our business is our own. But we're willing to pay for information." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Maybe you recognize this face." Barrett leaned in. It was a wanted poster, but not an official one. Privately printed. A huge reward. The drawing was a good likeness of Elena, but the name wasn't Elena. It was Sarah Mitchell. And the charges were theft and fraud. This was a lie. A well-funded, dangerous lie. "Can't say I've seen her," Barrett said, handing the poster back. "You could try asking in town." One of the other men spoke, his voice rough. "Already did. Saloon keeper mentioned you won a woman in a poker game." Barrett's jaw tightened. "Murphy, the town gossip." "That's right. An indentured servant named Elena. She moved on yesterday, headed east with a family." It was a smooth lie, but Garrett didn't buy it for a second. His hand drifted closer to his gun. "Funny thing about that," Garrett said, his voice turning cold. "We checked the stage line. Nobody matching her description has left town all week. Now I'm thinking you're not being truthful with us, Mr. Callahan." Garrett knew his name. That meant they'd done their homework. "And I'm thinking you boys should move along," Barrett replied, his voice dropping an octave. "This is private property." Garrett let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's where you're wrong, Callahan. We know all about you, the famous gunfighter trying to play rancher. But you're just one man, and we are 3. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. But either way, we are going to search that house." In a single fluid motion born of 1,000 dangerous moments, Barrett's hand went to his gun. The old reflexes were still there, sharp as ever. "I don't think so," he said. The air crackled with tension. 4 men, locked in a deadly standoff. Through the window, Barrett saw Elena's face, pale but composed. She understood exactly what was happening. Garrett finally broke the silence. "Tell you what," he said, his hand still hovering over his pistol. "We'll leave. For now. But we'll be back. And when we come back, we'll bring more friends." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Think about it, Callahan. Is protecting that woman worth dying for?" The 3 men mounted their horses. But as they turned to leave, Garrett called back one last time, his voice laced with venom. "And Callahan? That woman in your house. She's not who she says she is." He smiled that razor-thin smile again. Ask her about the Van Holland family. Ask her why people with more money than God have put a price on her head." And with that they rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a storm of unanswered questions. Barrett watched them disappear over the ridge before dismounting. He walked into the house, his mind racing. Elena met him at the door. "They were looking for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "They had a wanted poster," Barrett said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Called you Sarah Mitchell. Said you were wanted for theft." Elena closed her eyes, a deep weariness settling over her features. When she opened them again, the carefully constructed walls were gone. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice heavy with resignation, "I think it's time I told you the truth. The real truth about who I am. And why those men don't just want to capture me. They want me dead." Elena sat at the rough kitchen table, the afternoon sun lighting the gold threads in her dark hair. She held herself like royalty, even in a simple work dress. As it turned out, that's exactly what she was. "My real name," she began, her voice steady, "is Elena Van Holland. My mother is Baroness Catherine Van Holland of the Austrian Netherlands. My family has held titles and lands for more than 300 years." Barrett just listened, pouring them both a cup of coffee. He'd seen enough strange things in his life that a runaway baroness didn't seem entirely impossible. "3 months ago," she continued, "my uncle, Marcus, tried to seize control of our estates. My mother is a progressive ruler. She modernized our family's mining operations, improved conditions for the workers, built schools. My uncle and his allies, they believe in the old ways. They believe her compassion is weakness." Her voice turned bitter. "When they couldn't persuade her with politics, they resorted to violence. There were 3 attempts on my life in as many weeks." Barrett finally understood the constant watchfulness, the way she never sat with her back to a door. She wasn't just hiding. She had been hunted. "The last attempt was a bomb in my carriage," she said, her composure cracking for just a moment. "My driver, he saved my life, but he lost his own. My mother's advisors insisted I disappear. They smuggled me out of the country, gave me a new identity, Sarah Mitchell, a merchant's daughter. I was supposed to travel to San Francisco, to allies who would keep me safe." "What went wrong?" Barrett asked. "Silas Morton," she said, her voice hardening. "He was on the ship from Europe. He recognized me from a newspaper photo. He saw an opportunity. He could hold me for ransom or sell my location to my uncle's assassins." The pieces clicked into place. Morton wasn't just a desperate gambler. He was a clever parasite. "He knew a missing noblewoman would attract official attention," Elena explained. "But an indentured servant? In the American West, a person like that can simply vanish." Suddenly, the sound of an approaching wagon sent Barrett to his feet, his hand on his gun. He relaxed when he saw it was just Jake Muller, the storekeeper, with his supply wagon. "Stay inside," he told Elena. "Afternoon, Barrett," Jake called out, his face etched with worry. "Brought the supplies you asked for, and the extra ammunition." He lowered his voice. "Those strangers are still in town, holed up at the hotel. They've been asking questions about you, about your past." After Jake left, Barrett carried the supplies inside. The extra boxes of cartridges felt heavy with foreboding. Elena was watching him from the kitchen table. "They won't give up," she said. "My uncle has more money than you can imagine. He hires the best. Men who don't stop until the job is done." Barrett set the ammunition on the table with a heavy thud. He looked her straight in the eye. "Then we need to make sure you know how to use one of these." For the next 2 hours, the quiet valley of the rocking sea echoed with the sound of gunfire. He started her with his father's old Winchester rifle. It was a reliable, beautiful weapon. Elena proved to be a natural. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. She listened intently, absorbing every word. "You've handled a gun before," Barrett observed, impressed, as she put 3 shots in a tight grouping on the target he'd set up. "My father believed a practical education was important," she replied, a sad smile touching her lips. "He taught me to ride, to shoot, and to think strategically. He said knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from you." As the afternoon light faded, Barrett found himself looking at her with new eyes. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was a survivor. She began asking tactical questions, assessing the ranch's defenses, pointing out fields of fire and potential weaknesses. "The house is well positioned," she noted, her gaze sweeping over the surrounding terrain. "Good visibility. The rock formations make a surprise approach difficult." "You think like a soldier," Barrett said. "My father was a colonel in the Austrian army before he became a baron," she said simply. "He taught me that to win a battle, you must first understand the battlefield." That evening, over a simple dinner, the air between them had changed. They were no longer a rancher and his mysterious guest. They were partners, allies. "Elena," he said, "I want you to know, they'll have to go through me to get to you." She looked up, her expression softening. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why risk your life for a stranger? You could have taken their reward money." Barrett thought about it, rolling the old poker chip in his hand. Why was he doing this? The answer was simple, and it was complicated. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "And because I spent too much of my life doing the wrong things. Maybe it's time I stood and fought for something that matters." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the desert came alive with the sounds of the night. But tonight, Barrett was listening for different sounds. The snap of a twig, the crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. The peace was over. War was coming to his valley. And as he looked at the woman across the table, he knew he was ready to fight it. The attack came just before dawn. The air was still cool, the sky just beginning to bleed light in the east. Barrett was already awake, a cup of coffee in his hand, his Colt within easy reach. He had been expecting them. Men like Garrett didn't make idle threats. The first warning was the nervous whinny of his horse from the corral. Barrett moved to the window. He saw a flicker of movement among the rocks overlooking the house, a glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel. "Elena," he called softly. She appeared instantly, already dressed, holding his father's Winchester. She looked calm. Ready. The sight filled him with a fierce, protective pride. "How many?" she asked, moving to a side window to cover the southern approach. "At least 3 in the rocks," he said, checking his own rifle. "They'll try to pin us down and flank us." The first shot shattered the front window, spraying glass across the floor. They both hit the deck. Elena reacted without hesitation, a soldier taking cover. "They're trying to circle around back," she said, her voice steady. "It's a classic pincer movement." Barrett was again struck by her tactical knowledge. "Can you watch the rear?" "Yes," she said. The single word was filled with a confidence that he trusted completely. He moved to the front of the house, keeping low as bullets thudded into the stone walls. Through the broken window, he could see muzzle flashes from 3, maybe 4, positions in the rocks. They had good overlapping fields of fire. These were not amateurs. He waited for a lull, then popped up and fired 3 quick, aimed shots. The return fire was immediate and furious, driving him back behind cover. These men were disciplined. They fought like a unit. From the back of the house, the Winchester barked twice. A moment later, Elena called out, "One down, but there are at least 2 more coming up through the arroyo." Barrett felt a surge of admiration. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Fighting for her life with a courage that was truly noble. The sun climbed higher, turning the house into an oven. The siege dragged on. It was a deadly dance of fire and movement. The stone walls of the ranch house, which he'd built with his own hands, were now saving their lives. During a brief pause in the shooting, he crawled over to her position. She was reloading the Winchester with smooth, practiced motions. He saw a dark red line on her left arm. A graze. "You're hit," he said, his voice rough. "It's nothing," she replied, but she let him tear a strip from his shirt to bandage the wound. As his hands worked, he was acutely aware of her closeness, the warmth of her skin, the steady rise and fall of her chest. "Elena," he started to say, not even sure what the words would be. She reached up with her good hand and gently touched his cheek. Her fingers were cool against his rough skin. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." The world seemed to fall away for a heartbeat. In the midst of chaos and death, something new and fragile was being born between them. Then another hail of bullets shattered the moment, and they were back to the grim business of survival. But everything had changed. Now, they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for each other. As noon approached, the firing from the rocks began to slow. "They're pulling back," Elena observed. "Why?" "They're either low on ammo," Barrett reasoned, "or they're planning something else. Professionals like this don't just give up." The answer came an hour later, in the form of a familiar wagon rumbling up the trail. It was Jake Mueller from town, but he wasn't alone. Doc Harrison was beside him, and 3 other townsmen with rifles rode alongside. Help had arrived. Jake pulled up to the house. "Barrett, you folks all right in there?" Barrett cautiously opened the door, his rifle still ready. The rocks above the house were silent. Garrett's men had vanished. "One of the ranch hands heard the shooting and rode into town," Doc Harrison explained, already grabbing his medical bag. "We came as fast as we could." As the townsfolk gathered, Barrett gave them a carefully edited version of the story. Bounty hunters, a case of mistaken identity. He watched Elena thank the men for their courage, her grace and dignity shining through despite the dirt and bloodstains. But he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Garrett and his men had tasted defeat. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Next time, they would come with overwhelming force. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sky burn crimson and gold. Elena's arm was properly bandaged. The broken windows were temporarily boarded up. A fragile peace had returned. "They will be back," she said softly. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," Barrett agreed. "But next time, we'll be ready." She turned to him, and in the fading light, her eyes were filled with a mixture of trust, affection, and something far deeper. "Barrett," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you. Not just for protecting me, but for showing me what true honor looks like." He reached for her hand, feeling the new calluses forming on her soft skin. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." They sat in silence as the first stars appeared, a shared understanding passing between them. They were no longer just allies. They were something more. The danger had forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel, and they were both going to need that strength, because the war for Elena Van Hollen's life had only just begun. For 2 weeks, a tense quiet settled over the ranch. But it wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. Jake Mueller reported from town that Garrett and his men were still there, asking questions, gathering information. They were planning something big. During that time, Barrett watched Elena blossom. The woman from the saloon was gone. In her place was a brilliant, resourceful leader. She worked alongside him, reinforcing the house, planning defenses, her mind as sharp as any general's. It was during one of these work sessions that she revealed the true stakes of their fight. She came out of the house holding something wrapped in a cloth. "Barrett," she said, her tone formal, "I need to show you something, so you understand what we're really up against." She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a ring. It wasn't large, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. A deep blue stone, engraved with a coat of arms, a lion and a castle tower, was set in intricately worked gold. "This is the Van Holland signet ring," she said. "It has been passed down for 12 generations. It signifies the head of our family. My mother wears it now. This one is mine." Barrett took the ring, feeling the weight of history in his palm. "Why show me this now?" Her expression grew dark. "Because the men hunting me are not just assassins. They represent something far more dangerous. My Uncle Marcus isn't just trying to take over the family estates. He is part of a consortium of powerful figures who want to undo all the progress my mother has made. They want me dead, so the inheritance passes to him, unopposed." The words hit Barrett like a physical blow. This was bigger than he could have imagined. "How much money is involved?" "The Van Holland estates control copper mines, steel mills, shipping interests across Europe. The income could fund a small army," she said. "And that's exactly what my uncle plans to do. He wants to fund reactionary movements, to crush the very idea of democracy and restore the old, oppressive monarchies." Barrett stared at the ring, finally understanding. This wasn't about a family squabble. This was about a fortune that could shape the future of nations. "There's more," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My mother has been secretly using our family's wealth to support those democratic movements. She's been a secret patron of reform across the continent. If Marcus gets control, he won't just stop that funding. He will hunt down and destroy everyone she has helped." She took the ring back and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "So this is about more than just your life," Barrett said slowly. "This is about the future of freedom in Europe," she confirmed. "And that is why they will never stop. They have unlimited resources. They have no morals. And they are hunting us." Barrett knew she was right. They couldn't just sit here and wait. Sooner or later, Garrett would come back with an army. They'd be overrun. "We need help," he said. "Professional help." "I have contacts in San Francisco," Elena said. "Allies of my mother. But that's 800 miles from here. And Garrett's men will be watching every road." She was right. It was a suicide mission. Barrett looked out at the land he loved, the home he had built. He was about to lose it all. But then he looked at Elena, at her courage, her resolve. The ranch was just land. She was what mattered. "There might be another way," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I have contacts of my own. Men from the old days. Men who owe me favors." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What kind of men?" "The kind who know how to fight impossible odds," Barrett said. "The kind who know that sometimes the only way to win a war is to take the fight to the enemy." That night, Barrett wrote 3 letters. Each one was a call to arms, sent to a ghost from his past. A plea for help from the man who never asked for any. "Will they come?" Elena asked, as he sealed the last one. "They'll come," Barrett said, though he wasn't entirely sure. It had been a long time. He looked at Elena, the lamplight catching the ancient ring on her finger. He wasn't just fighting for a woman anymore. He was fighting for a cause. His peaceful life was over. The outlaw he had tried to bury was about to be resurrected. And this time, he was fighting on the side of the angels. The first of his old gang arrived 3 days later. Barrett recognized him from a mile away, just by the way he sat his horse. Frank Morrison. His face was more weathered, his hair grayer, but his eyes were just as sharp, and the matched colts on his hips looked like they were still a part of him. "Barrett Callahan," Frank said, a slow grin spreading across his face as he dismounted. "Never thought I'd see the day you settled down." "Frank," Barrett replied, clasping his old friend's hand. "Never thought I'd see the day you answered a call for help without asking what the pay was." Frank laughed, a sound that brought back a flood of dangerous memories. "Maybe I'm getting soft," or maybe I still owe you for that time in Tucson. His eyes fell on Elena as she stepped onto the porch, and his smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise. Barrett made the introductions. Elena extended her hand with a grace that seemed to momentarily stun the grizzled gunfighter. Over dinner, Barrett laid it all out. The princess, the conspiracy, the assassins, the stakes that stretched all the way across the Atlantic. When he was done, Frank let out a long, low whistle. Well, Barrett, you never did like to do things the easy way. He looked at Elena with new respect. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is the kind of fight that gets good men killed. Elena met his gaze without flinching. Mr. Morrison, I am aware of the risks. This is not just about my life. It is about preventing my uncle from starting a fire that could burn down all of Europe. Frank studied her for a long moment, then looked back at Barrett. She's not what I expected. She's more, Barrett said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. The second man arrived the next morning. Tommy Brennan, still red-haired, still quick with a laugh, though life had carved new lines around his eyes. He was the youngest of the crew, and still had a spark of wild energy. Barrett, you old dog, he shouted, swinging down from his horse. A letter from you is like seeing a ghost. When Elena came out carrying a hand-drawn map of the ranch and the surrounding area, Tommy fell silent. Barrett watched with admiration as she treated these rough men, these former outlaws, with a genuine courtesy that immediately earned their respect. Gentlemen, she said, spreading the map on the porch table, I believe we need to discuss strategy. Frank and Tommy stared at the map. It was incredibly detailed, marking terrain, approach routes, and potential defensive positions. This is military-grade reconnaissance, Frank said, stunned. My father was a soldier, Elena replied simply. He taught me to think like one. They began to plan. They knew Garrett would come back, and he would come back with more men. Waiting at the ranch was a death sentence. We need to choose the battlefield, Elena said, her finger tracing a line on the map. Not let them choose it for us. She pointed to a narrow pass about 5 miles away. Here, Devil's Gate. It's a natural choke point. A small force could hold off a much larger one. It's an ambush, Tommy said, his eyes lighting up. We draw them in. It's risky, Frank countered. If they don't take the bait, or if they circle around, we're trapped. All our options are risky, Barrett said, his gaze meeting Elena's. But she's right. We fight on our terms. That night, as the 3 old friends sat on the porch, Barrett saw the way they looked at Elena. She had won them over completely. These hardened, cynical men were ready to die for her. Barrett, Frank said quietly after Elena had gone inside. That woman. She's one of a kind. Don't you let her go. I don't plan on it, Barrett said. There was a third man you wrote to, Elena said, appearing in the doorway. Will he arrive? Barrett's face grew serious. Miguel Santos. He was our planner, the smart one. If he's coming, he'll be here. If not, then we go with what we have. 4 lives against a shadowy organization with unlimited funds. The odds were terrible. But as Barrett looked at the determined faces of his friends and thought of the woman sleeping inside his house, he felt a surge of confidence. He had been a simple rancher, trying to escape his past. Now, he was a general, preparing for the most important battle of his life. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Miguel Santos arrived on the 4th day, and he wasn't alone. Barrett saw the 2 riders approaching from the south. One was Miguel, his compact, wiry frame unmistakable even at a distance. The other was a woman. She was older, perhaps in her 40s, elegantly dressed despite the trail dust, with steel gray hair and an air of absolute authority. Most striking were her eyes. They were the exact same deep, intelligent brown as Elena's. Barrett's confusion cleared the moment Elena stepped out of the house. She froze, her face going pale, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mother?" she whispered. The elegant woman dismounted with a fluid grace and rushed forward, her own composure breaking as tears streamed down her face. "Elena, my child! My brave, foolish girl." They met in a desperate emotional embrace. Barrett and his men watched in stunned silence. The reunion was a raw, powerful storm of love and relief. Miguel walked over to Barrett, a grim look on his face. "My friend," he said, "I hope you are prepared for things to get much more complicated." "I'm starting to get used to it," Barrett said. "How did you find her?" "She found me," Miguel explained. "She has her own network of agents. She has been tracking Elena across the entire country." Later, gathered around the kitchen table, the woman introduced as Baroness Catherine Van Holland laid out a story that made everything they'd faced so far seem like child's play. "My brother Marcus did not just attempt a coup," she began, her voice ringing with authority. "He committed treason. He forged documents, including a death certificate for Elena, to seize control." She produced a sheaf of papers from a leather portfolio. Forgeries, legal documents, letters. "He didn't just want the family fortune," Catherine continued, her eyes flashing with anger. "He is the head of a secret cabal of European aristocrats and industrialists. They plan to use our wealth to finance a series of political assassinations and military coups, to roll back a century of democratic reforms, and plunge the continent back into a new dark age." The room was silent. This wasn't a family feud. It was an international conspiracy that threatened to ignite a world war. "The men hunting Elena are not just assassins," the Baroness said. "They are the agents of this cabal. They cannot allow her to survive. She is the one person who can expose them." Frank whistled softly. "No wonder they're so determined." "But I did not come empty-handed," Catherine said. She pulled another set of documents from her bag. "I have spent the last 3 months gathering evidence. Financial records, signed confessions, letters that implicate everyone involved, including my brother." She spread the papers on the table. "The originals are on their way to Washington, D.C. But these copies are enough to bring down the entire conspiracy. If we can get them, and Elena, back to Europe." The mood in the room shifted. They were no longer just defending. Now, they were on the attack. "Getting you to a port is our new mission," Barrett said. "San Francisco is the closest." 800 miles, Miguel said, his strategic mind already working. "Through territory that their agents have had weeks to prepare." Elena, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm. "There is something else. If we succeed, if we expose Marcus and return to Europe, what happens to the life I have started to build here?" Her eyes met Barrett's across the table. The unspoken question hung between them. She was asking him to choose between his world and hers. "My dear," her mother said gently, "duty has always demanded sacrifice. It was a choice between 2 futures, 2 lives. A life of power and responsibility in a European palace, or a life of simple peace on an Arizona ranch. But first, they had to survive." "One problem at a time," Barrett said, his voice rough with emotion. "First, we get you to San Francisco, alive." The men bent over the maps, their conversation turning to routes, supplies, and tactics. The small defensive war had become a cross-country mission of vital international importance. Barrett looked at Elena. The reunion with her mother had changed her. She now carried herself with the full weight of her heritage. The quiet woman from the saloon was now a princess with the fate of nations resting on her shoulders. His quiet life was gone forever, but as he looked at the woman he had come to love, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. Some things were worth any price, and Elena Van Holland was worth everything. The plan was no longer to hide and fight. The plan was to run. But Miguel's reconnaissance delivered grim news. "They're not just watching the ranch," he reported, his face dark. "They have men on every major trail between here and California. At every water hole, every town. It's a net, and we're the fish." They were trapped. A journey of 800 miles through open country was impossible. Garrett's men would pick them off at their leisure. The mood in the ranch house grew desperate. Then, Catherine Van Holland played her final card. "There is one more option," she said, producing another sealed portfolio. "Before I left Europe, I was given diplomatic authority to negotiate with the United States government. The evidence we carry is of immense value to their intelligence services." She broke the seal and unfurled a document bearing the official stamp of the U.S. State Department. "In exchange for our full testimony, they have offered us official protection. I have the authority to request a military escort. A cavalry escort. It was a lifeline." "The nearest major post is Fort Huachuca," Catherine explained. "It's 60 miles southeast of here. If I can get a message out, they can meet us." 60 miles of rough country," Miguel said, already poring over his maps. "But it's doable. We can avoid their main surveillance network." But Elena saw the hidden cost. "Mother," she said, "if we do this, it becomes an official international incident. We will be giving intelligence to a foreign power. We can never truly go home again. We would be assets, to be protected, but also to be controlled." Her dream of simply returning to her family's estate was dissolving. The choice was becoming starker. A life of gilded captivity as a political asset. Or something else. Her eyes found Barrett's. That night, as they made their final preparations, the air was thick with unspoken words. They were leaving the ranch at dawn, leaving behind the sanctuary where their unlikely story had begun. "Barrett," Elena said, as they packed ammunition side by side. "Whatever happens, these weeks here with you, they have been the only truly real moments of my life." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Elena," he said, his voice husky, "you made this place a home. Before you, it was just a place I was hiding." She reached out and took his hand. "When this is over," she whispered, "I will find my way back to you. I promise." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I'll be waiting," he said, "no matter how long it takes." It was a promise made against impossible odds. A promise that their journey and their fight was not just about politics or fortunes, but about a future they both desperately wanted to build together. At dawn, they rode out. 5 riders against a conspiracy, carrying the secrets that could save a continent. They left the rocking sea behind, a ghost in the morning light, and headed southeast, into the wilderness, toward the faint hope of salvation at Fort Huachuca. But their enemies were already waiting for them. They had been riding for 3 hours when Miguel returned from his scout ahead. His face was a mask of grim resolve. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "At least 6 of them. They're dug in at Willow Creek. It's an ambush." Barrett knew the place. A narrow canyon, the only reliable water for 20 miles. It was a perfect kill box. Anyone who approached would be cut down from the cliffs above. "We can't go around," Miguel said. "It would add 2 days to the journey. We don't have the water." Then Catherine delivered the final blow. "My diplomatic authorization is time-sensitive. If we do not reach Fort Huachuca within 48 hours, the offer of an escort is withdrawn." They were caught. To go forward was to walk into a trap. To wait was to lose their only hope of survival. It was Elena who saw the only way out. A terrible, desperate gamble. "A diversion," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They will be watching the main approach. If some of us can circle around and attack them from the rear—" No, Barrett said instantly. You are not going to be the bait. She turned to him, and her eyes were filled with the steel of a monarch. Barrett, this is no longer about my life. The evidence we carry is more important. The lives of thousands depend on it. Sometimes the queen must be sacrificed to win the game. Frank, who had been studying the canyon through field glasses, lowered them slowly. She's right, Barrett. They won't be expecting an attack from behind. It's our only chance. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Frank and Tommy would take the long, hard climb to get above and behind the ambush. Miguel would stay with the horses. Barrett would ride in with Elena and her mother, using the thick morning mist that rose from the creek as their only cover. It was a suicide run, but it was the only run they had. As they prepared to separate, Elena came to Barrett. She held something wrapped in silk, her signet ring. If I don't make it, she said, pressing it into his hand, see that this gets to the right people. It represents everything my family stands for. Honor, duty, sacrifice. Elena, you're going to make it, he said, his voice tight. Perhaps, she replied, a sad wisdom in her eyes. But these weeks with you, they gave me a life I never thought I could have. A life worth fighting for. She rose on her toes and kissed him, a soft, brief touch that carried the weight of a final goodbye. I'm holding you to your promise, Mr. Callahan. A future. Together. The mist was thick, clinging to the canyon floor like a shroud. Somewhere in the rocks above, Garrett's men waited. Frank and Tommy were moving into position. The world held its breath. Remember, Barrett said to the two women, his voice a low growl, when the shooting starts, you ride. You ride for the creek and you don't look back. Your mission is to get that evidence out. No matter what. Elena met his gaze, her love for him shining through her resolve. We survive this together, Barrett. Before he could answer, the morning silence was shattered by the crack of a rifle from the cliffs above. Frank and Tommy had opened the ball. Now! Barrett yelled. They spurred their horses, charging into the mist, into the heart of the ambush. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets whizzed past their heads. Barrett saw muzzle flashes in the rocks, the faces of grim men determined to kill them. He returned fire with his Winchester, the familiar weapon a deadly extension of his will. He saw a man fall, but more appeared. They were almost to the creek, almost to the cover of a rock outcropping, when he saw it. A rifleman, taking careful aim, not at him, but at Elena. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the flash, heard the crack, saw Elena flinch in the saddle. He let out a roar of fury and fired twice, his shots finding their mark. The rifleman tumbled from his perch. They reached the rocks, diving from their horses, dragging the precious portfolio with them. Elena slumped against the stone, her face pale, a dark stain spreading on her shoulder. She was hit. And then, Barrett heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, coming from behind them. Reinforcements. The ambush at the creek wasn't the main trap. It was just the bait. It was designed to pin them down, to hold them here while a second force closed the net. 8 more riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, cutting off their escape. They were surrounded. Outnumbered. Elena was wounded. This was the end. But as Garrett's men closed in for the kill, a new sound cut through the roar of gunfire. Faint at first, then growing louder. A bugle call. Catherine's face, etched with despair, was suddenly illuminated with a wild, desperate hope. The cavalry! They found us! On the ridge behind them, a line of blue-uniformed soldiers appeared, their sabers flashing in the morning sun. The U.S. cavalry had arrived. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Garrett's men, caught between Frank and Tommy's attack from above and a full-blown cavalry charge from the rear, were thrown into chaos. The fight was brutal and short. When the dust settled, Garrett and most of his assassins were dead. The conspiracy's long reach had finally been cut short in a dusty Arizona canyon. Barrett rushed to Elena's side. The wound was bad, but Doc Harrison, who had accompanied the cavalry, was already working on her. She was going to live. As they carried her toward the ambulance wagon, her eyes found his. "You kept your promise," she whispered, a weak smile on her lips. He took her hand. "I always will." 6 months later, Barrett Callahan stood on the porch of his ranch house. The bullet scar on his own shoulder was a dull ache, a permanent souvenir of the battle at Willow Creek. The world had changed. Elena's evidence, delivered to Washington, had created an international firestorm. The cabal was exposed, its leaders arrested. Her uncle Marcus was in prison. A war had been averted. Elena had become a hero, testifying before diplomats and governments, her grace and intelligence dazzling the old world she had fled. A carriage was rolling up the drive. Barrett's heart skipped a beat. She stepped out, no longer the frightened fugitive, but a woman fully in command of her destiny. She was dressed elegantly, but moved with the easy confidence of someone who was equally at home in a palace or on a ranch. She had returned from Europe 3 weeks ago. Not to the ranch, but to Tucson, handling legal matters. "The territorial governor has approved the land grant," she said, her smile radiant. "And the bank has approved the loan for the expansion." She was using her family's vast resources to triple the size of the rocking sea, to build it into something more than just a cattle ranch, a sanctuary. "I have been planning our future," she said softly. "If you still want one. With a complicated former princess." Barrett didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple iron ring, one he had forged himself from metal found on his land. He dropped to one knee. "Elena Van Holland," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face, but her smile was brighter than the Arizona sun. "Barrett Callahan," she whispered. "I thought you'd never ask." He slipped the simple iron ring on her finger, next to the ancient signet of her noble house. 2 worlds, 2 lives, forged into one. They sat on the porch swing as the stars came out, their hands intertwined. They talked of the future, of building schools and hospitals, of creating a new kind of community in the valley, a blend of old world ideals and new world grit. They talked of children, who would grow up knowing both the weight of a crown and the feel of honest dirt on their hands. He had won her in a poker game, a piece of collateral in a desperate man's bet. But in the end, she had won him. She had saved him from his past and given him a future he had never dared to dream of. The outlaw and the princess, in their sanctuary, under the vast desert sky. They had faced down assassins and conspiracies, and had found something far more precious than any fortune. They had found home. If you enjoyed this story of how a lone rancher and a runaway princess took on the world, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've got another story for you tomorrow that you won't want to miss.